a lot of people experience what they would call a spiritual encounter with psilocybin in particular. It tends to open up the possibility for connection with something that transcends the self. That's why, chaplains and spiritual care providers are particularly interested in working with psilocybin in end of life. I think I can say that with a fair degree of confidence, but then as soon as I say that, there will be an exception, and there's someone who worked with psilocybin and not understand it from a spiritual lens at all, and so we have to just be respectful of all of the diversity of experiences and views, worldviews.
Hey, it is Keith Fiveson here, and welcome to the Mindfulness Experience podcast, where we explore the intersection of mindfulness, spirituality, and personal growth today. And we're excited to have Dr. Jamie Beachy joining us from the Psychedelic Science 2023 MAPS Convention. Dr. Beachy serves as the faculty lead for Naropa's Master of Divinity program and is deeply involved in the world of psychedelic therapies and spiritual caregiving. So let's dive into our conversation. All right. Dr. Beachy, thank you, first of all, for joining us today. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your journey and what led you to become involved in both the fields of spiritual care and psychedelic therapies.
Thank you, Keith. It's wonderful to be here with you today at this very energetic and inspiring conference with more than, you can gather the exact number of participants, but it's in the 12,000 range, so really incredible for Denver and for the field of psychedelic care and psychedelic science. So my journey began as a practitioner of Christianity throughout most of my life and growing up here in Denver. And then in college I decided to, study religious studies and was really interested in philosophy and theology of religion, but found my way into chaplaincy as a profession. And so I've worked many years as a professional chaplain in healthcare, first as a Christian minister, and then eventually over time growing into more of an interreligious view of professional chaplaincy, learning from so many people coming, into those caring experiences with me from a deep diversity of traditions. And so learning from those traditions, mostly from the patients and clients, and also from other colleagues, and so now practice as an interreligious chaplain. And, being present there with people in those moments of trauma and loss and death and dying, working in hospice and palliative care, trauma care, and also in the field of ethics. But in those moments with people as they're really deeply suffering from these experiences, I, over time, just became really compelled by the research around psychedelics and how that might address some of the experiences that people have in those darkest moments, of their lives, and that psychedelics might help, integrate and heal and maybe transform those experiences from just a sense of stuckness or, in the MAPS MDMA studies, transforming PTSD into something more stable and more healthy in the person's life, or transforming, end-of-life fear and distress into something expansive and supportive, and maybe having less of that fear. And so just really compelled by the science, started to pay attention to it and become more involved, and then ended up having the fortune to be on the MAPS MDMA-assisted therapy study as a co-therapist. And learning about that through training with MAPS and through the supervision, of really skilled MAPS MDMA therapists. And now I'm at the place of trying to bring some of these insights into my role as a, assistant professor at Naropa University and director of education for the Center for Psychedelic Studies, Naropa's new center for psychedelic discourse and training and exploration. And so we're really excited to be leaders in the field during this time, and look forward to how chaplaincy might continue to evolve as the field of psychedelic care evolves.
Well, it's a very exciting time indeed, and having 12,000 people here is absolutely incredible. And we've heard from some wonderful leaders, including you. You've had some sessions here. And I'm wondering, as you start looking at the development and the path of psychedelic therapies as a chaplain and a spiritual care educator, how do you see the role of chaplaincy evolving in the context of psychedelic therapies?
Well, I really feel that chaplaincy has a lot to contribute to the field of psychedelic care and therapies. Professional spiritual care providers, are trained to know ourselves really well, and the theological, metaphysical commitments that we bring to the field of psychedelic care or professional chaplaincy or other roles that we may find ourselves in hospice. And so to know ourselves and to understand our own metaphysical, spiritual, theological commitments and know how to to bring the best of that into the space with another person without imposing our bias or interfering with the ways that their own intelligence is informing their process in a psychedelic journey, let's say, and maybe the religious beliefs and practices and the commitments they bring are really need to be the priority. And so we know how to do that well. And chaplains also are trained to be, especially chaplains that train in a contemplative capacity, I would say, know how to really bring this presence that is calm, stable, non-reactive, able to receive whatever is in the atmosphere with generosity and open-heartedness, and not, react, not add distress to an already distressing situation. So there's the sense of presence, and also really navigating the non-ordinary states that people experience in psychedelic care. So knowing how to really support people as they're navigating these sometimes really scary spaces, sometimes very expansive and illuminating, and just all of this territory, is familiar to anyone who's done this deep inner work in their own, theological, metaphysical landscape to explore, either through meditation or perhaps through deep yoga practice or other spiritual practices, just this human and perhaps transcendent or transpersonal, landscape of experience, and is known to most chaplains through their training and their spiritual commitments. So how psychedelic care will transform chaplaincy is interesting because, not all chaplains are open to this at this point, and not all religious professionals are open to thinking about psychedelics as a spiritual path. And but many are, and I would say probably the vast majority are, especially as this brings relief to human suffering and really contributes to health and well-being. I think there is a lot of openness, but there are taboos and other perhaps obstacles that will need to be addressed in the society, and perhaps they're there for good reason, to slow us down a little bit in our enthusiasm and bring some caution forward so that we aren't overly enthusiastic and move into this a little more quickly than is really beneficial.
Well, that's wonderful, and it's great that you're seeing that kind of interest, specifically because in our society we find that there are like three things that you're not supposed to talk about, sex, politics, and dying. And I think sex and politics are off the table at this point because, we have a society where certainly there's a lot of that going on, sex and politics discussions. But still, the big area of taboo seems to be death and the discussions around death. And I'm wondering, you developed a curriculum for an advanced certificate in palliative care chaplaincy. Can you share with us some of the key elements of the curriculum and how it prepares chaplains to work in the palliative care setting? Yeah,
so chaplains receive generalized training, in how to be present to people in crisis and illness and loss, but many in their programs would not necessarily receive the more extensive training in palliative care. And so the certificate is designed to bring chaplains and spiritual care practitioners, perhaps nurses or people from other disciplines as well, into a greater understanding of the field of palliative care in general. So how the medical system cares for chronic illness and those who are approaching, terminal diagnoses, and end-of-life care is included as well, of course. And so first it's just orienting to that field in general and the best practices and the, ways of understanding chronic and serious illness and interventions. And then we bring in spiritual assessments and different models for approaching the spiritual dimension of palliative care and hospice, and how spirituality is so much a part of, approaching a terminal illness or a chronic illness or a cancer diagnosis or any kind of serious experience with one's health. Just brings you into this metaphysical or existential, crisis a lot of times. And their chaplains are really there to support the existential distress that people can experience at the end of life, or demoralization, as it's sometimes called in the field. That sense of despair or just loss of hope that can come up. And so there are many models that come from the field of medicine, nursing, social work, counseling, that we bring into the discussion with the learning around spirituality and palliative care. And this is a good introduction to the landscape for people who have some basic training in professional spiritual care but are looking for a little bit more of a specialization. I would love to see a section on psychedelics and psychedelic care. That would be a beautiful addition to the certificate, or perhaps a certificate for spiritual care practitioners eventually, and that is surely down the road, whether it's something that I would develop or others would bring together, because there's certainly a lot of interest and a lot of need.
Well, that sounds like a very comprehensive program. It's something that I'm attracted to, and I think for most people in the field, they certainly want to have an understanding of, in the spiritual area, working with people who are at the end of life, concerned, worried, and how to really have that presence, that's their therapeutic presence of being with them. And it's wonderful. So I'm wondering, in terms of the psychedelic aspect, you had your work with MAPS, the MDMA-assisted therapy phase 3 study. What have you observed regarding the potential benefits and the challenges of integrating psychedelic therapies into spiritual care? And are we really talking about MDMA here? Or are we looking at, like in John Hopkins' example, looking at psilocybin? Is there a perspective? I'm just wondering your view and your experience.
Sure, and just first to be clear that I'm speaking, from my own experience, not on behalf of MAPS or MAPS PBC. But just to say that all of the psychedelic therapy modalities, I think, would benefit from attention to the spiritual dimension of health. So whether it's MDMA-assisted therapy or psilocybin therapies, there is certainly the person coming into that therapy context, or the persons, if it's a group context, certainly bring their spirituality and their commitments and their religious experiences and the whole of who they are into that space. And so spiritual care practitioners and just an attention to the spiritual dimension of that care is certainly important. And I look forward to the ways that the data will be more deeply considered over time, so we can understand what were the spiritual dimensions of the therapy that was taking place there, as the data will be available. And I think there'll be much interest in looking into that more thoroughly. But certainly the role of chaplains will be hopefully meaningful over time in all of these modalities, along with other clinicians, in this interdisciplinary capacity, because you obviously need a physician and you need people that are attending to safety and psychotherapists are of course key to the development of all of these fields, and social workers and nurses. And my hope would be that we'd have this interdisciplinary unfolding of these fields, and as the field also clarifies what it will take to become an ethical, capable, competent, psychedelic practitioner, regardless of the background that someone is originally coming from in their training.
Well, that sounds wonderful. And back to the question, I'm thinking about the MDMA versus the psilocybin. Do you think that there is a specific difference in terms of the actual use? Because MDMA is certainly a heightened sense of self, a bliss awareness, and you get the same impacts. MDMA question of whether or not it's a psychedelic, whereas perhaps psilocybin would be an amplifier or a real connection. Perhaps I'm wondering your thoughts about that.
Well, I would really direct you to the published research and to some of the experts here at the conference who are speaking into that with more specificity. I think each of these medicines has their particular brilliance, and MDMA is often referred to as an empathogen because of the ways that it increases, from a chaplaincy perspective, what we might call warm-heartedness or compassion, self-compassion, compassion for others. Psilocybin is also can evoke those similar qualities, and I guess that's a deep question that's hard to cover in a conversation like this. But I would say that that they each have their particular brilliance, and now all of these brilliant and dedicated and really committed researchers who are here at the conference this week are teasing out the particulars of, psilocybin in contexts, obviously end-of-life care and terminal care. Psilocybin has proven to be really beneficial, but there are people exploring, whether psilocybin can be beneficial to chronic pain or other types of conditions, perhaps physical conditions, as well as spiritual and existential psychological conditions. And so the field is just burgeoning in this really incredible way, and it's exciting to see all of the resource and just all the brilliance that's going toward clarifying exactly how and when, these medicines work and for whom. And so even though I'm a spiritual care clinician, I think the science is the place to look for some of the insights, or how and when and for whom, and so I could give you my personal experience, with psilocybin, but I think that there is certainly a lot of people experience what they would call a spiritual encounter with psilocybin in particular. It tends to open up the possibility for connection with something that transcends the self. That's why, chaplains and spiritual care providers are particularly interested in working with psilocybin in end of life, and just people that are seeking existential support in general, or even just expansion. Maybe there isn't necessarily a problem, but, people who are looking for just to enhance their spiritual development. And so, I think I can say that with a fair degree of confidence, but then as soon as I say that, there will be an exception, and there's someone who, will work with psilocybin and not understand it from a spiritual lens at all. And so we have to just be respectful of all of the diversity of experiences and views, worldviews. And, I love first of all, I love the answer in the sense that everyone is different, and everyone's body chemistry and experiences are different. And certainly that's why we have the research and the science and, the assessment. And again, still, there are exceptions, right? It's not a one-all done, kind of an approach. One of the things you talked about, though, I thought was very, important is this palliative care team. The understanding that it's not only about the spiritual caregiver, the chaplain,
the ability to go ahead and then have someone who ministers or administers the medicine, and also a team that's available nearby to go ahead and work, psychotherapists and so on. We're at this convention, and we see a lot of, in the exhibit hall particularly, a lot of these sort of churches pop up. And certainly I'm wondering if you can discuss the importance of ethics in spiritual caregiving, particularly when working with patients undergoing psychedelic therapies.
Yeah, ethics is a really broad topic, and certainly one that's really dear to my heart, and also just so important for the field at this time. Unfortunately, there are people that will take advantage of others in non-ordinary states of consciousness, and just the vulnerability that comes with substance, use, and the expansive and vulnerable states that they can evoke. And so we have to be really attentive to accountability for those who are, allowed to legally or, offer psychedelic therapies, and that they're not doing that in an isolated way that puts the client and the patient, and also the practitioner, honestly, at risk of violation. And so the field is really working on ethical guidelines, and there are a lot of people who care about this, who are thinking about it deeply, and there's been a lot of conversation about this at the conference this week. In terms of religious practice, I think some of the religious communities are also making commitments to accountability, transparency. Too often in the religious world, when misconduct happens, and outside of the world of psychedelics, sexual misconduct or financial exploitation, or there's a resort to secrecy and trying to protect the institution rather than the person who was harmed or the people who were harmed. And that includes, the criminalization of substances, actually, for particular communities, that people from marginalized communities have experienced their substances, as criminalized. And then in other cases, there's been permission for exploration, among other communities, like who are less at risk of being imprisoned for exploring, substances in ways. And so, I think that the religious communities haven't always, sometimes their taboos and restrictions have impacted communities of color in particular in harmful ways. So ethics is really a deep issue, and something that I hope the churches, the religious leaders, the psychologists, the researchers are all having this deep conversation, and that we can value transparency, accountability, learning from each other, speaking openly with each other when things don't go well, really thinking about ethics more broadly than just a one-on-one behavioral kind of a thing, but really how are we living together as a society in a good way? Are we protecting those who need protection? Are we, addressing unfair laws and restrictions on certain communities in relationship to others? Is our research representative, or is it just mostly focused on, certain kinds of privileged populations, and so our data isn't accurate? I mean, there are just so many layers to that question that it's like but in almost every talk that I've been in here at the conference, this has been a part of the conversation, and that's really heartening. And so I think that the field is aware of a lot of risk, and also a lot of potential for coming together in a good way to bring some really positive structures and solutions and ways to address, this field and this work in a good way that might contrast how some religious communities have dealt with similar issues in the past, or even the psychological community as well.
Right. Yeah, and the ethical question, I think, is really where the guardrails are, and the ability to really keep us on the road going forward, following the lines or following the right practices so that, we're not you don't want to be, the headline for today's news story, especially given the particular issues and the vulnerabilities that individuals are going through. I'm wondering, when you look at interreligious dialogue and, the important aspects of spiritual care, how do you incorporate, this concept into your teachings and practices, especially, as you mentioned, working with diverse populations, people who are maybe of, the BIPOC community, people who are not necessarily appreciated, seen, heard, and or, just at this point in their lives really haven't been maybe cared for in the right way through a spiritual practice or a traditional religion that they've been a part of.
Yeah, I would say the first invitation would just be toward appreciation and developing relationships with communities that are meaningful. And so I think appreciating the spiritual practices that people do bring, because they're sometimes not embedded in formal religious communities. So it could be, music, dance, any kind of resiliency building community, activities, I think, are part of one's spirituality, or ways that people connect and take care of themselves when they're in distress or suffering. And so expanding our view of spirituality would be the first invitation to include, being, for many, many people, probably more people historically than not, if we look into the deep historical view, connectedness with the natural world and a feeling of belonging as a part of this interrelated web of nature is more commonly one's spirituality than going to a special place and offering prayers in like a temple or a church or a building, and so recognizing that people are drawing from spirituality, whether or not they're part of some kind of formal organized religion or not, whether or not they're following a leader, or that spirituality is just a part of our human inheritance and our biological way of being in the world, that we're not alone. We're intimately related to family, to loved ones, to community, to the community of the more than human world. And so taking all of that into account when you're present with someone in a psychedelic session, it might be that in several sessions I've been a part of, it's been maybe the tree outside of the window that's visible that becomes part of the spiritual experience of the person, or especially if you can be outside, connectedness with nature is so important. But also, having also an appreciation for organized religion. So if you're someone who's more attuned with nature and maybe has rejected organized religion for reasons having to do with no longer feeling that you belong, or maybe feeling a sense of critique of the history of colonization and all of the ways that, if we take Christianity, my own tradition of birth as an example, has caused so much harm. So many people have turned away from that tradition. But if you're in a session with someone who is coming from a traditional Christian view, to have appreciation and to have worked through your own, maybe feelings of aversion to that tradition or rejection of something maybe that has harmed you yourself or others. So to have worked that out before you get into that space, or your attitude toward the Muslim community or Judaism, and having some knowledge of those traditions. If someone who's Jewish is in a session and they say, I'd really like to share the Shema, and you think, and the person's like, I've never heard of that. What is this? You should at least know the basic kind of prayers. And if you have no idea what the Lord's Prayer is, then you'd probably look it up, before you go into sessions with people that are coming from a Christian culture, because that could come into the space. And it's okay, we can't know everything for everyone all of the time, but to know have a basic appreciation of most of the traditions that people are likely to bring in with them from their communities, and how those traditions work in at least a general sense, and then holding back from presenting yourself as an expert in their tradition, of course, because just because you know a prayer or two doesn't mean that you really know the tradition either. It's just an opportunity to connect and to say, to acknowledge that the person and their experience is welcome.
Right. So there's this aspect of spiritual care when we talk about that. It's really caring for the individual, caring what their spiritual path is, caring about their story, understanding that everyone has a story in them to go ahead and tell, and everyone wants to be seen, heard, and recognized, rather than moving into fear, not feeding that, but really helping them to bring out the story and helping them to be present for whatever they're going through, and that really requires your sense of empathy.
Yeah, and I would also say just having a warm-hearted curiosity. Just this person before me has lived this life that's been complex, and it's included loss and joy and heartbreak and every human experience, especially someone who has been alive for some decades, and you think this person brings this rich journey with them, and how can I just have this open-hearted, curious, humble, hospitable. It's like walking into someone's home. How can you respect, I'm in this person's home, I'm in their spiritual home, and I don't want to insult their food or not have thought beforehand about how I might bring a spirit of generosity in there. Maybe I want to bring a gift with me. I just want to come with a deep appreciation, honoring that I've been invited into this space, and that it's personal, tender, sacred space to be sitting here with this person, and how to just do that with integrity, and that's where mindfulness can be really meaningful. To have a practice you're bringing in the space, and not just all of your distraction and reactivity, and but to really pay attention with love.
That's wonderful, and certainly love, we've heard it before, but love is everything. It's the ability to open up, the ability to be present, the ability to have compassion, all of those wonderful things. And you've said it so well. I love that idea of going into someone's home, because we're all residing, our bodies, our experiences, our mind, our body, our spirit, what we experience in our lives is really sacred. It is a part of our home, if you will. So I'm wondering, just to go back to your position as the faculty co-director for Naropa's Center for Psychedelic Studies, what are some of the center's main objectives and initiatives, and how do you envision that impact on the future of psychedelic research and therapy? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, so a colleague and I, Dr. Sarah Lewis at Naropa University, along with some other close colleagues, and certainly a lot of other people that attend to, the operations of the university and fundraising and just the infrastructure of Naropa, came together and decided to launch this Center for Psychedelic Studies at Naropa. And it has really evolved to include other leaders now who've come to help us develop programming there. So my role has evolved to Director of Education for the center, and Sarah's role is now the Director of Training and Research. And I hope people would visit the website to see the many other people that have contributed, to the development of the program. It's really been a success, and we are now, the center is in the second year of offering a certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies to practitioners from a diversity of professional disciplines who have some experience working in their fields, who've come together to learn psychedelic-assisted therapy, and the MAPS education that prepares one, for eventually working in the field of MDMA-assisted therapy with, some other steps required. Beyond the educational experience is included in the training. Yeah, and we also have a focus on psilocybin care and ketamine assisted therapy. Each of the practitioners who are in our certificate program will have a ketamine-assisted therapy experience or breath work as part of their training, so they'll practice, caring for another person in a real context with supervision. And outside of the certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapy, which is mindfulness-based, it's the only, in my understanding, contemplatively based, training in collaboration with MAPS that's offered out there. Along with the certificate, I'm in my role as Director of Education focusing on developing degree program opportunities too. So we're very hopeful that in a few years we'll have a BA in psychedelic studies. We're working toward that as a academic goal for the center, and also a concentration in psychedelic studies at the master's level. And courses, we already have many faculty at Naropa who are teaching in the areas of psychedelic studies, psychedelic care, psychedelics in eco-psychology, psychedelics in literature, psychedelics in art. I mean, there are many creative, leaders at Naropa already, including this material in their courses. So we're just gathering that insight and interest, as well as the therapeutic, modalities that are developing, and bringing all of that into the degree programs is really important to me personally, because I think we want, students who have grants, perhaps from their VA benefit, or people who can get financial aid, to be able to do this learning and as part of their degree program experience, and not just have to apply for a psychedelic therapy certificate program, postgraduate in some years, but people that want to be learning all along. And I will say too that our certificate, we offer many BIPOC scholarships, and are really committed to, addressing diversity in the field and promoting diversity and justice and equity in the field, and are working also to bring in indigenous advisors. So one of our indigenous advisors, Belinda Aracho, is speaking, I think, at this moment in one of the big halls, and she's been offering a lot of her wisdom here at the conference this week. And so we think that our values are in the right place, and our commitment to the field is there, and there's a lot of excitement right now at Naropa about bringing the insights of this Buddhist-inspired university into the field of psychedelic care and education.
I really am excited for you. It's exciting news indeed. And lastly, one last question. For those who are interested in pursuing a career in spiritual care or psychedelic therapies, what advice would you give them as they begin their journey, and your perspective around that?
Sure. I ran into a recent high school graduate yesterday while I was volunteering at the Chacruna Institute table. I'm an advisor to the Chacruna Institute, and they're one of our partners. And he said, I think I'm only one of the only young people here. I'm really excited to get involved in this field. And I was helping him connect to some of the other Gen Z, or maybe even Gen Alpha people who are here at the conference. So to people of that age, who are moving into maybe thinking about going to college or studying, traveling, learning, I would say, find out if there is appreciation and interest among the if we take the university experience as one example, find out if your professors are knowledgeable and interested in psychedelic care or psychedelic science or literature, wherever your interest is, and move toward those people, instead of thinking of, I have to go to this institution or that one, because some of the big institutions, they're catching up, but sometimes the smaller places like Naropa are the places that are a little bit further down the road with thinking about, this in terms of, especially at the BA level of learning. And then for people who are practitioners already working in the field, or perhaps offering therapy, chaplaincy, working as psychiatrists or physicians, nurses out there, body workers. There are many training programs to look into, and some of them are very oriented toward profit, honestly, and just getting as many people through as they can in the quickest way possible, like, of course, we'll find in a capitalist society where people see that there's opportunity for profit here. And so just be cautious and really look into the values of the organization, talk to alumni, perhaps look into what is the mission. Is it, nonprofit, university-led? Is it more for-profit? Are they taking ethics seriously, reciprocity with indigenous traditions and communities, and pay attention to the ways that the field is developing standards, and you want to align with the training organizations that are really involved in those conversations around standards and are taking seriously collaborating with other communities. And lastly, I'd say, really beware of people pronouncing themselves as spiritual leaders. I know yourself as a yogi, you would have knowledge of, traditions that sometimes misrepresent, or people that misrepresent themselves, or,
Copyright us.
Yeah, exactly. If someone's copywriting, a blindfold or a something in the therapy session, be cautious, and maybe just beware and take your time and be patient too, because the field is going to have room for you. There's going to be more than enough room for all of us to do the work that we want to be doing in this field, and sometimes there's a sense of urgency that takes over, and people might sign up for programs because that's the one they got in and they have to do this now. And I would say just take a mindful approach, be patient, listen for what really is right, listen to your intuition, talk to community members, people who care about you, and think about how to do this really in the right way, not in the fast way.
Wow. Well, Dr. Jamie Beachy at Naropa University, certainly look into it. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing your insights and your experiences with us today. I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing, both in spiritual care and psychedelic therapies, and we're excited to see how this field really evolves and continues to evolve and intersect with science and the data. And to our listeners, thank you for joining our Mindfulness Experience podcast today. Until the next time, stay mindful and stay curious. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. It's been a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you for listening to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. We have other exciting guests coming up in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. For more mindfulness tips and tricks, visit our website at workmindfulness.com. Thanks again for being a part of the Mindfulness Experience. This is Keith Fiveson.